The calculated gesture, when politics meets humanity at 30,000 feet. In the pressurized cabin of American politics, where every gesture is calculated and every moment choreographed, it was a seemingly spontaneous act that would capture the national imagination. Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary whose rapid ascension through Republican ranks had made her both a target and a symbol, stood in the narrow aisle of a packed commercial flight, her decision hanging in the air as tangibly as the overhead announcements. The first-class seat, that small rectangle of privilege that separates power from the masses, was hers by right. The administration had insisted on it, citing security protocols and the need for workspace during transcontinental flights. But as Leavitt's gaze fell upon the elderly man struggling to navigate toward the economy section, something shifted in the careful political calculus that governed her every public move. He wore his Vietnam service cap with a quiet dignity that transcended the partisan divides Leavitt navigated daily. The insignia, faded but meticulously maintained, spoke of sacrifices made half a century before, when today's political battles were not yet conceived. The veteran's weathered hands, gripping the seat backs for stability as the line of passengers built behind him, told a story that no press briefing could capture. "Sir," her voice cut through the ambient hum of the cabin, "I believe you should take my seat." The exchange that followed occurred beyond the reach of official press pool cameras, a rarity in Leavitt's tightly managed public life. Yet even in this relative privacy, the political implications couldn't be ignored. In an administration frequently criticized for its relationship with military veterans, the symbolism was potent. Whether calculated or genuine, such moments inevitably enter the complex algorithm of public perception. As the veteran settled into the wide leather seat, accepting a courtesy that seemed to transcend political theater, Leavitt moved toward the back of the plane, past rows of passengers whose phones had already begun documenting the exchange. In the modern political arena, privacy exists only in the moments before social media engagement begins its inexorable climb. For Leavitt, whose daily existence consisted of navigating hostile press questions and crafting narratives that could withstand the relentless scrutiny of a divided nation, this unscripted moment presented both opportunity and vulnerability. The administration's communication strategy had long emphasized authentic connections with real Americans, a phrase repeated in strategy documents and messaging memos circulated throughout the West Wing. But authenticity, that most coveted and elusive political currency, cannot be manufactured. It emerges in the spaces between planned appearances, in the split-second decisions that reveal character when the teleprompter offers no guidance. As she settled into the cramped economy seat, Leavitt became aware of the whispers spreading through the cabin. Recognition dawned on faces, some appreciative, others skeptical. A mid-level staffer from a competing campaign, seated 3 rows back, was already typing furiously into his phone. By the time the aircraft reached cruising altitude, the story would be circulating through political channels, subject to the interpretative filters of a polarized media ecosystem. The veteran, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the political undercurrents. He had lived through an era when sacrifice was expected rather than exceptional, when duty transcended the partisan frameworks that now defined American life. His quiet thank you, offered as Leavitt surrendered her seat, carried the weight of a generation for whom service was not a photo opportunity. As the plane climbed above the patchwork landscape of America, Leavitt found herself in an unusual position, physically removed from the power center of the aircraft, and momentarily freed from the constant performance of her role. Through the small window beside her, the country below appeared unified, its divisions invisible from altitude. What began as a gesture, whether calculated or spontaneous, was transforming into something more complicated. The veteran had turned in his seat, making eye contact with Leavitt across the class divide of the aircraft cabin. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that transcended the political machinery grinding away in Washington. He beckoned her forward. Leavitt hesitated, aware that every movement would be observed, interpreted, and judged by countless invisible audiences. The narrative was no longer entirely in her control. Whatever happened next would not be found in any communications playbook or crisis management strategy. As she rose from her seat and moved toward the veteran, Leavitt couldn't know that this encounter would soon become more than a fleeting human connection at 30,000 feet. It would become a litmus test for American values, a Rorschach through which partisans would see confirmation of their deepest suspicions or highest hopes. The veteran extended a weathered hand, holding something that glinted in the harsh cabin light. Around them, passengers leaned forward, straining to witness an exchange that would soon transcend the confines of this aircraft and spill into the broader cultural battleground waiting below. The inheritance of kindness. The veteran's calloused hands trembled slightly as he reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. What emerged was not the military medallion observers might have expected, but a faded photograph, its edges soft from decades of handling. Passengers nearby strained to see, their phones temporarily lowered, in deference to what was clearly becoming an intimate moment above the clouds. "Your grandfather," the veteran said, his voice carrying the weight of memories long preserved. "Thomas Leavitt." Karoline Leavitt's carefully constructed professional demeanor faltered for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression that would have been imperceptible in the White House briefing room, but was starkly visible in the unforgiving intimacy of this airborne encounter. The photograph showed two young men, arms draped over each other's shoulders, standing before the war-ravaged landscape of Vietnam's Central Highlands. One was unmistakably the veteran, decades younger. The other, a man whose features Leavitt had seen only in family albums and holiday portraits. "I came home broken," the veteran continued, unaware or perhaps unconcerned that dozens of passengers had fallen silent, bearing witness to this unexpected collision of personal history and political present. Not all wounds were the kind they give Purple Hearts for. The cabin seemed to contract around them as he spoke, his story floating above the partisan frameworks that typically defined Leavitt's world. He described returning to a nation divided, wearing his uniform on the final flight home, only to be met with averted gazes and whispered accusations. The America that had sent him to war had transformed in his absence, leaving him a stranger in his hometown of Bedford. "Your grandfather owned the hardware store then," he said, his weathered finger tapping the face in the photograph. "First person who shook my hand when I came back. Not just shook it, held it. Looked me in the eye when half the town wouldn't." For Leavitt, whose career had been built navigating the machinery of modern political warfare, this encounter operated outside familiar strategic parameters. The veteran wasn't speaking to her as the voice of an administration, but as the inheritor of a familial legacy she had rarely referenced in public life. "He gave me work when nobody would hire a shell-shocked vet," the man continued. "Let me sleep in the stockroom those first months until I could afford rent. Never once asked which way I voted." As he spoke, the narrative of community that transcended political identity unfolded, one increasingly foreign in the hyper-polarized ecosystem Leavitt navigated daily. Thomas Leavitt, as described by this veteran, represented a disappearing ethos of American life, practical compassion unhindered by ideological purity tests. "He used to say there's policy, and then there's people," the veteran said, "and people always matter more." The irony wasn't lost on those listening. Leavitt, whose professional existence was defined by crafting narratives that served policy objectives, was confronted with a counter-narrative from her own family history, one that suggested political identities should be subordinate to human needs. Passengers who had been documenting the interaction now watched with a curious ambivalence. The encounter had transcended the simplistic frameworks of partisan theater, becoming something more difficult to categorize or weaponize. A Democratic strategist seated in the third row recognized the potent authenticity of the moment, the kind campaign spent millions trying to manufacture. For her part, Leavitt seemed caught between worlds. The press secretary, whose rapid-fire responses left White House correspondents scrambling, was momentarily silent. The political calculus that governed her professional existence offered no formula for this moment's complexity. "He never mentioned that he'd pulled strings to get me that VA appointment," the veteran continued, his voice carrying the distinctive cadence of New Hampshire's rural communities. "Found out years later he'd called in favors from the State House to the governor's office. Never wanted credit." The photograph passed between them held more than memories. It contained an implicit question about the distance between the America represented in that image and the one they currently inhabited. It suggested continuities and ruptures in national character that transcended any single administration's messaging strategy. "I voted against your boss," the veteran said with the blunt honesty of a generation less concerned with performative politeness. "Probably will again. Your grandfather wouldn't have cared one bit." The confession hung in the air, creating a moment of electric tension. In normal circumstances, such a declaration might trigger Leavitt's well-honed defensive reflexes. But something about the veteran's transparent sincerity defied conventional response. What happened next would be interpreted differently, depending on the observer's political alignment. Those inclined toward cynicism would see calculated performance, others, a genuine human connection briefly transcending the machinery of political warfare. Leavitt reached for the photograph, her fingers brushing against the veteran's weathered hand. "Tell me more about him," she said. "The parts one never knew." As the plane continued eastward, carrying this unlikely conversation across state lines and ideological boundaries, something subtle shifted in the cabin's atmosphere. For a brief interval, the grinding mechanisms of political tribalism seemed to pause, revealing the faint outline of a different way of being American, one increasingly difficult to locate on any contemporary map. The inheritance of kindness, a legacy rediscovered at 30,000 feet. In the pressurized cabin of Flight 1289, history collapsed into the present as a weathered photograph bridged 50 years of American life. The veteran, whose name would later become a footnote in countless news cycles, hadn't planned this encounter. Yet something in Leavitt's profile, glimpsed from 3 rows back, had triggered a cascade of memories that politics alone couldn't contain. Karoline Leavitt, the woman whose voice translated administration policy into digestible soundbites, found herself suddenly stripped of her professional armor. The photograph in her hands, her grandfather alongside a much younger version of the man seated beside her, rendered her momentarily speechless. For the White House press secretary, known for her rapid-fire deflections and precise messaging discipline, this silent vulnerability registered on the political Richter scale. "Thomas Leavitt gave me back my humanity when I couldn't find it myself," the veteran continued, his New England accent thickening with emotion. "When half of Bedford treated Vietnam vets like we were contagious." Passengers who had been scrolling through partisan news feeds now found themselves witnesses to an unscripted moment of American reconciliation, several recorded surreptitiously, raw footage that would later be dissected on cable news panels and social media threads, each interpretation revealing more about the commentators than the moment itself. "The hardware store became my sanctuary," the veteran explained, unaware of the political capital accumulating with each word. "Your grandfather never asked what I'd done over there. Never questioned why I sometimes disappeared into the stockroom when the delivery trucks backfired." The irony was inescapable. Leavitt, whose professional existence revolved around crafting narratives that reinforced ideological boundaries, was confronted with a family legacy that transcended them. Thomas Leavitt's America, as described by the veteran, operated on principles increasingly foreign in the hyperpolarized ecosystem his granddaughter navigated daily. "He pulled strings to get me mental health treatment when the VA had a 6-month waiting list," the veteran revealed, his calloused finger tapping the photograph. "Called in favors from the State House to the governor's mansion, never mentioned it once." For political strategists monitoring the situation, the moment contained multitudes. A Democratic media consultant 3 rows back recognized its potency immediately, the kind of authentic connection that focus groups and campaign consultants failed repeatedly to manufacture. The Republican National Committee communications director, texting furiously from first class, saw potential for humanizing narratives that could soften Leavitt's sometimes combative public image. The veteran, oblivious to these calculations, continued unfiltered. "I voted against your administration," he admitted with the blunt honesty of a generation less concerned with performative politeness. "Probably will again." "Your grandfather wouldn't have cared one bit. He measured people by what they did, not who they voted for." The confession hung in the recycled air, creating a moment of electric tension. Those expecting Leavitt's trademark defensive pivot were surprised when her professional mask slipped further. "Tell me about the day this was taken," she asked, her finger tracing the photograph's worn edge, voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than strategic calculation. What unfolded over the next 20 minutes became something surveillance cameras captured, but couldn't truly document, the subtle transformation as Leavitt discovered dimensions of her grandfather's character, absent from family holiday gatherings and sanitized eulogies. The veteran described Thomas Leavitt's quiet acts of community maintenance, extending credit during economic downturns, creating employment for those society had discarded, building bridges across cultural divides that politics attempted to enforce. Each anecdote illuminated corners of American possibility increasingly obscured by partisan fog. "He used to say there's governing, and then there's community," the veteran recounted, "and community is what happens when the governing fails." Leavitt's reaction, a complex mixture of pride and disorientation, reflected the cognitive dissonance of discovering your heritage contains wisdom at odds with your professional frameworks. The political operative who crafted messages dividing Americans into neat demographic categories was confronted with a familial legacy that refused such simplification. As the captain announced their initial descent into Reagan National, something subtle shifted in Leavitt's demeanor. Those nearest observed a barely perceptible straightening of posture, a recalibration happening behind her eyes. "I'd like to hear more," she said, reaching for her phone. "Perhaps after we land?" The exchange of contact information that followed would later be scrutinized for strategic intent. Was this genuine connection or calculated optics? The answer remained elusive, even to those who witnessed it firsthand. What no one in the cabin could have predicted was how this chance encounter would reverberate through the coming weeks, creating ripples that would eventually return to shore as waves. The veteran's story, and through it, Thomas Leavitt's legacy of pragmatic compassion, was about to enter the bloodstream of American political discourse, challenging narratives on both sides of the ideological divide. As Leavitt gathered her belongings for landing, the photograph returned to the veteran's pocket. But the inheritance it represented had already transferred, a quiet exchange of memory and possibility, happening entirely outside the choreographed performances that typically defined Washington's rhythms. The true significance of this airborne encounter wouldn't become clear until 3 days later, when Leavitt would stand at the podium facing a press corps hungry for conflict, carrying something new alongside her briefing binder and talking points. Something that would subtly alter the administration's approach to its most contentious policy battle yet, the digital aftershock, when private moments become political currency. Within hours, what had transpired in the pressurized cabin of Flight 1289 breached its sealed environment. The veteran's weathered photograph and Leavitt's uncharacteristic vulnerability, now digital artifacts circulating across platforms that reduced complex human moments to shareable content optimized for engagement. The footage, captured by at least 7 passengers on various devices, underwent rapid metamorphosis as it spread across America's fractured information ecosystem. What began as raw documentation splintered into dozens of competing narratives, each tailored to confirm existing biases and reinforce tribal boundaries. This calculated performance demonstrates the administration's desperate attempt to humanize a deeply unpopular agenda, declared a conservative commentator whose podcast had tripled its subscriber base during the previous election cycle. His segment, which skillfully edited out the veteran's mention of Thomas Leavitt's compassion, garnered 17,000 shares within 40 minutes. A progressive outlet countered with its own interpretation. Watch as Leavitt discovers her family's progressive roots, proof that empathy runs counter to her administration's policies. The accompanying analysis emphasized Thomas Leavitt's community support systems as proto-socialist structures, drawing connections that would have bewildered the hardware store owner himself. Algorithmically sorted into ideological silos, Americans consumed fundamentally different versions of the same human encounter. In living rooms across Nebraska, the footage appeared with a bottom third graphic reading, quote, "Press Secretary confronted by veteran," while apartments throughout Brooklyn received it with, "Republican spokesperson learns family's inclusive history." Social media platforms, designed to maximize emotional response rather than nuanced understanding, supercharged the polarization. Comment sections beneath each version of the video became digital trenches where the already convinced fired rhetorical ammunition at enemies they would never face in person. "This is performance art from an administration built on lies," wrote at Patriot Defender 1776, whose profile featured an eagle superimposed over a flag. The comment received 3,214 likes. "Maybe she'll finally understand what her grandfather knew, that community matters more than corporate profit margins," countered at Progressive Wave, garnering 2,886 likes and 427 shares. Neither commenter had watched the unedited footage. The veteran himself, whose name had now entered the public domain despite his preference for privacy, found his military record scrutinized by digital sleuths on both sides. Those aligned with Leavitt's administration uncovered minor inconsistencies in his service dates, while opposition researchers discovered social media posts criticizing immigration policies that could be weaponized to discredit him among progressive audiences. Media strategists monitoring these developments recognized the moment's malleability. In a third-floor conference room overlooking K Street, communications consultants debated emergency response strategies for a half-dozen clients with stakes in the administration's next policy initiative. "The footage is emotionally resonant but politically ambiguous," noted a former network executive who now commanded 7-figure consulting fees, "which means we can shape public perception if we move aggressively in the next 12 hours. Meanwhile, in a suburban home outside Bedford, the veteran watched with increasing disbelief as his private conversation metastasized into political spectacle. His phone, suddenly flooded with interview requests and messages from long-lost acquaintances, sat silenced on his kitchen counter. The photograph that had sparked the encounter remained in his wallet, its personal significance now competing with its public symbolism. Leavitt, trained to navigate media hurricanes, maintained official silence as competing narratives proliferated. Her communications team monitored sentiment analysis in real time, watching as artificial intelligence systems categorized millions of reactions into data points that would inform the administration's eventual response. "We're seeing unusual cross-demographic resonance," reported a data analyst, sliding a tablet across the conference table, "particularly among voters who typically tune out political messaging entirely." What made the footage particularly destabilizing was its resistance to conventional framing. Thomas Leavitt's America, as described by the veteran, operated according to principles that predated the hyperpartisan sorting now governing national discourse. His community-centered pragmatism belonged to a political lexicon increasingly foreign to both sides of the ideological divide. As night fell in Washington, senior administration officials gathered to assess whether this unexpected moment represented threat or opportunity. The conversation on Flight 1289 had introduced variables outside their carefully constructed narrative architecture, authentic human connection that defied focus-grouped messaging discipline. In newsrooms preparing the next day's coverage, editors grappled with similar questions. Was this story about political hypocrisy, intergenerational wisdom, the commodification of human experience, or something more fundamental about America's capacity for connection across deepening divides? The answer would emerge not from the moment itself, but from how Americans chose to interpret it, a test of whether the nation could still find common meaning or would continue its descent into parallel realities with incompatible truths. For Leavitt, sleepless in her Georgetown apartment, the stakes transcended political calculation. As she reviewed the unedited footage on a secure tablet, she confronted questions more personal than professional. What would Thomas Leavitt make of the world she was helping create? And could his approach to community still function in an America where shared facts had become an endangered resource? The answer would begin to materialize at tomorrow's press briefing, where 70 journalists were already preparing variations of the same question. And Leavitt, for perhaps the first time in her political career, found herself uncertain of exactly what she would say when the cameras began rolling. The politics of compassion, calculating sincerity. By morning, Leavitt's team had shifted from damage control to opportunity assessment. What had begun as an unscripted moment of vulnerability was now being meticulously processed through the machinery of modern political strategy, the raw human exchange distilled into polling data, message testing, and tactical positioning. What the public didn't see were the tense strategy sessions unfolding behind closed doors in the West Wing, where communications specialists debated how to weaponize authenticity, that most precious and depleted resource in American politics. "We're sitting on narrative gold," insisted a young digital strategist, whose meteoric rise had been fueled by his ability to transform human moments into viral content. "This is Leavitt showing she's more than the administration's shield. It's her origin story." Across the mahogany table, the deputy chief of staff, a veteran of 4 presidential campaigns, remained skeptical. "The moment we package this, we destroy what made it powerful in the first place," she countered, tapping her pen against polling data that showed Americans' growing exhaustion with manufactured emotion. "The second this looks calculated, we've lost the narrative." Meanwhile, Leavitt herself sat alone in her office, the veteran's words still reverberating in her consciousness. For 23 minutes, staff members noted the unusual gap in her calendar with growing concern. She remained unreachable, wrestling with something more consequential than optics. The political architecture she had helped construct suddenly seemed at odds with her grandfather's vision of community. The dissonance was not merely philosophical, but visceral. Outside the administration's tightly controlled environment, media outlets were already framing the encounter according to their ideological imperatives. Conservative platforms characterized Leavitt's response as evidence of the administration's fundamental dishonesty, a momentary crack in a well-maintained facade. Progressive outlets seized on the contradiction between Leavitt's apparent emotional response and the policies she routinely defended with clinical precision. "What we're witnessing," explained a behavioral psychologist on an afternoon panel discussion, "is the public's sophisticated ability to detect the difference between genuine emotion and strategic vulnerability. Americans have developed a remarkably accurate inauthenticity radar after decades of political performance. By midday, focus groups in swing districts were already being shown carefully selected clips of the encounter, their reactions measured by consultants who specialized in the quantification of emotional response. In sterile rooms with two-way mirrors, ordinary citizens unwittingly participated in the calculus of how Leavitt's moment would be positioned for maximum political advantage. "I just want to know if she meant it," said a 52-year-old independent voter from Macomb County, Michigan, articulating the central question that political operatives were desperately trying to answer through algorithm and analysis. The administration's chief pollster, reviewing preliminary data in real time, noted a striking pattern. The encounter was resonating most powerfully with voters who had grown disillusioned with both parties, citizens who had retreated from civic engagement not out of apathy, but exhaustion with political theater. "These numbers suggest we're dealing with something that transcends traditional partisan response patterns," she explained to the chief of staff. "This isn't registering as a political moment, it's registering as a human one." That distinction presented both opportunity and danger for an administration that had built its communication strategy on message discipline and strategic information control. Authentic moments couldn't be manufactured, but once captured, they could be leveraged. Or they could spiral beyond containment, developing narrative momentum that defied conventional management techniques. In a digital war room 3 floors below the Oval Office, data analysts tracked the conversation's evolution across platforms, watching as the encounter spawned competing hashtags and contradictory interpretations. What had been a private exchange between two individuals was now public property, raw material for America's perpetual meaning-making machine. "We're seeing unusual cross-platform penetration," noted the administration's digital director. "The footage is breaching typical ideological containment barriers. People who never engage with political content are sharing this." As strategy sessions continued throughout the afternoon, the fundamental question remained unanswered. Had the American public witnessed a rare moment of genuine connection between power and citizenship, or merely an unusually effective performance of vulnerability from a skilled political communicator? The answer would shape not only how the administration leveraged the moment, but whether Leavitt herself could reconcile the growing distance between her public role and private convictions. As preparations for tomorrow's press briefing intensified, she faced a choice more consequential than any talking point: whether to retreat into the safety of political calculation or risk stepping beyond it into territory both personally authentic and professionally hazardous. What had started as an unexpected encounter on Flight 1289 had evolved into something far more significant: a test case for whether genuine human connection could still survive in a political ecosystem engineered to commodify it. By tomorrow morning, America would have its answer.